Thanks very much. I'm just going to speak briefly a little bit about where this text comes from, what it might or might not be, and give you a couple things to look for in the performance. I haven't seen it. I'm really excited to see this show. The number of times that Bestrafte Brudermord has been performed in the last 300 years before this production is approximately 0. And the chances, I think, of ever seeing it in our lifetime again is like 0% chance. So this is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, which I'm very excited to see. It's also an attempt to solve a mystery, the mystery of what this text is. And Hamlet is not only a play about a ghost who comes back from the dead, but weirdly, it's also a play with texts that keep coming back to us from oblivion. And repeatedly, we've had to try to figure out exactly what these other texts of Hamlet are. Hamlet was probably written sometime around 1600. We don't know exactly when. The text that we study and perform and read that you all are familiar with in one way or another comes from 2 printed editions, one in 1604 and one part of the first folio of 1623. And those differ in small ways, but they're basically the same play, same text. But the key dates in the history of Hamlet for our purposes tonight come about 200 years later. The first is 1779 in Germany, when there was the discovery of a manuscript owned by a famous German actor and theater manager who had recently died. And this was Bestrafte Brudermord, usually translated as fratricide punished, or the punishment of the brother killer. This manuscript had on it the date 27 October 1710. This is our first ghost because we don't really know what this date means. Was this the date the manuscript was copied out? Was this the date of a performance? It's already, 70 years before the discovery of the manuscript. A couple years later, in 1781, the text is printed in a German literary journal. The text is in German, but it seems to be a German that it's a little bit of a weird German that people who know German very well think might suggest it was translated from English into German. So we're always at a few steps away from whatever this text originally was, and now the manuscript is lost. At some point in the interim, we've lost the manuscript entirely. So we keep trying to get back to what this text originally was, but we're always 3 or 4 steps away. It's like the scene when Marcellus and Bernardo and Horatio are trying to get a hold of the ghost, and he keeps reappearing at different points of the stage, and they say, "'Tis here, 'tis here, 'tis gone." Right? That's how it feels like to chase these texts to me sometimes. So what exactly is this weird other version of Hamlet that we'll see tonight? That's the big mystery. When it first popped up in Germany, people didn't pay very much attention to it. It sort of appeared in this little out-of-the-way journal and then disappeared again. But then there was another discovery, and this is 1823 in England, in a Downton Abbey-style manor house in the country of England. In the closet of one of the closets of this house, there was a printed book that had a bunch of Shakespeare plays in it, and one of them was this other version of Hamlet, a printed copy, now known as the First Quarto. Quarto is just the name for a format of book. It's also called Q for Quarto, Q1. And this one has a lot of curious differences from the Hamlet that we all know. It says right on the title page that it's by William Shakespeare. It's definitely the same play. The plot is the same. Some of the lines are the same, but other aspects of the plot and the poetry are quite different. So people, when this appeared, it caused a huge sensation. There were articles in like all of the daily newspapers about it. And people wondered, is this really by Shakespeare? The poetry is pretty bad at a lot of points. It doesn't quite sound like Shakespeare. Some people thought maybe it was his rough draft, but then could he really have turned this very rough, not great work into his masterpiece? Other people thought maybe this is a pre-Shakespearean Hamlet play. We do know that we know from allusions that there was a play about Hamlet on stage in the 1580s in London before Shakespeare had come to London or joined the London Theatre. The other main theory was that this was Shakespeare's play, but someone had come to the theater and tried to copy it down while it was going on in shorthand and garbled it and done a botched job of it. Or an actor had tried to remember the play and all the parts, not just his own, and couldn't quite remember it very well. The basic question here is Is there only one version of Hamlet by Shakespeare that's been misremembered or miscopied or mistranscribed? Or are there maybe many versions of Hamlet? Is Shakespeare's Hamlet an original work of genius? Or is it a spin-off or a remake? So now, after the discovery of the First Quarto, a lot more attention began to be paid to Bestrafte Brudermord because it shares some odd similarities. So the character that we all know as Polonius in both Bestrafte Brudermord and the First Quarto is called Carambus. For some reason, we have no idea why. That led people to start wondering if there was some connection between these two other versions. But at the same time, Brudermord has connections with the familiar version in ways that the First Quarto doesn't follow. So the opening line that we'll see of Brudermord, if you kept it in, is, "Who's there?" This is the famous opening line of Hamlet. The First Quarto instead says, "Stand, who is that?" So here, the agreement between the texts is the opposite, right? Brudermord, in fact, likes the line, "Who's there?" so much that they use it at the beginning of 3 consecutive scenes at the opening of the play. So we still don't really know what the relationship is among these Hamlets. It's still a mystery that scholars are debating. What we do know is that Brudermord seems to derive from the habit of English actors in Shakespeare's day, when they couldn't get work in London for one reason or another, packing up and touring the continent through Germany, through the Netherlands, through France, in the late 16th and early 17th century. We know from records that there was performances of Romeo and Juliet, Merchant of Venice, Julius Caesar, and other plays by Shakespeare's contemporaries like Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. These were performed in English, strangely enough, in the middle of Germany. English was not a language that really anyone in Europe cared to know. Later, after about 1600, they seem to have been performed in translation in German. Why is Brudermord's text then a kind of German that seems like maybe it was translated from English? Maybe it was originally performed in English and later translated and updated into German. But when they so how do you put on a show for a German audience that doesn't know English in English? When they performed in English, they had a clown who was a local comedian who would make jokes and translate into German. But an English traveler saw one of these shows in Frankfurt in Germany in the 1590s, and he said, "The Germans, not understanding a word they said, both men and women, flocked wonderfully to see their gesture in action." So these shows were heavily patronized, even though maybe no one originally understood a word of the show we're about to see. One thing you can look for in Brudermord is there's a lot of, compared to the Hamlet we know, there's a ton of added slapstick and Three Stooges-like comedy, physical comedy, that maybe derives from this context. So this is all pretty well established. The production we're about to see has a more hypothetical argument behind it, which is the argument of the scholar Tiffany Stern that Brudermord may be an adaptation for puppet performance. She notes that it's only about a fifth the length of Hamlet, which is a good length for a puppet show. There's a lot of action, farce, a lot of violence. Puppet shows are always very violent. And in the prologue, there's a lot of mythological creatures who fly around. Now, Shakespeare's theater could do flying, but on tour, in the middle of Germany, not in theaters that you know, it would be a lot easier to use puppets to fly around than real people. We know that these English troops toured around for years at a time. People in the company might die. They meet a local person and marry them and leave the company. And even they sometimes got forced into military service in one of the wars in Europe at this time. And we know that they did sometimes turn into a puppet troupe at that point. If they didn't have enough human actors to fill out all the roles of a play, they could supplement with puppets or turn into a puppet act altogether. We have a great record that Tiffany found from a puppet master in the 1660s who performed a play with a long German title that translates to King Lear of England. That is, the matter in which the disobedience of children towards their parents is punished, but obedience rewarded. Now, if you know Shakespeare's King Lear, that's not really what happens at all, right? Cordelia, who's the obedient daughter, dies just like the rest of them at the end. So actually, I wonder if this title suggests maybe a transformation of the Lear of Shakespeare. Maybe it's not Shakespeare's Lear, or maybe it's a transformation of Shakespeare's Lear in which Cordelia lives and it's given a happy ending. And actually, in the late 17th century in England, a rewrite of King Lear did just that for human shows. And that's how King Lear was performed for about 200 years. You never saw the sad ending of King Lear. On Tiffany's Tiffany gave me the lead and to do this and asked me to do this, I went to visit a guy on the outskirts of Bologna who's a little bit insane, but one of those insane people who has looked deeply into a subject. And he has in his basement, a very damp basement, and I'm worried about the objects there. It's not very good preservation location. He has a huge amount of puppet history in his basement. He has puppets going back to the 1600s and the 1500s. He has scripts. And he has a Hamlet puppet from the 1600s. He told me it was a Hamlet puppet. It's a guy dressed in black. It could be Hamlet. It could be, he has a skull, but the skull is not part of the puppet. It's like a skull, and then this guy put it onto the puppet. So, but he did know everything about puppet history, so it may well be a Hamlet puppet. I couldn't quite make it out. He also told me that the Freemasons run all the governments of Europe, so, so we don't know, but it is possible. He also told me that he has a script of a Hamlet puppet show from the 1700s, but he couldn't find it in this basement, which was like, you ever see Hoarders? It was like that. And he couldn't find the script, and I haven't been able to see it yet, but I really want to see it. So one thing to think about as you watch this is it's a piece of experimental theater. It's also a kind of scholarly experiment. Does this text make sense as a puppet adaptation of an adaptation of Hamlet for touring English actors in Germany? Right? That still leaves the mystery of what Hamlet is this play reproducing. Is it reproducing the Hamlet we all know? Is it reproducing the Hamlet of the First Quarto of Hamlet, which is different? Is it reproducing some other version of Hamlet that's been lost to us entirely? I just want to quickly give you like 3 issues or themes to look for in ways where we could see Brudermord differing from Hamlet and from the First Quarto in interesting ways, I think. In each case, to me, they suggest that Shakespeare's play, that the familiar version, walks a fine line on a certain issue. And the First Quarto and Brudermord each kind of push that fine line in one direction or the other, more to an extreme. First case is the question of Gertrude and her innocence or guilt. And this has been long debated. Did Gertrude know about the murder of Hamlet's father? Was she having an affair with Claudius beforehand? Was she part of the murder? You may remember that in the closet scene in Hamlet, when Hamlet kills Polonius, Gertrude says, "What a rash and bloody deed is this?" And Hamlet says, "A bloody deed, almost as bad, good mother, as kill a king and marry with his brother." And Gertrude says, "As kill a king," right, with like a question exclamation mark, "as kill a king." So there's been a lot of ink spilled on what does she mean there. It seems like she's expressing surprise at the whole idea of killing, that he was killed. But what exactly does "as kill a king" mean? The First Quarto, interestingly, when Hamlet tells her about the murder in this scene, she comes right out and says, "Look, I never knew anything about a murder. I didn't have any role in it. And from now on, I'm going to help you revenge your father's death against Claudius." And then we have scenes where she's teaming up with Horatio. They form like a little conspiracy of Horatio, Gertrude, and Hamlet to get Claudius. That's totally different from the version we know, but it seems like the First Quarto is trying to tidy up Gertrude's character and make clear that she didn't know. In Brudermord, when we watch the closet scene, you won't hear anything about the murder at all, actually. That's kind of just missing. Hamlet doesn't bring it up, and the queen repents of marrying Claudius, but because it's made her son mad, not anything to do with the murder. So one thing I think that we could watch for is, like, how does Brudermord represent Gertrude's character, her innocence or her guilt in this? That leads to the second question I want to talk about, which is about the other female lead, or female puppet lead, Ophelia. In Hamlet, Shakespeare seems to be walking a very fine line on questions about Ophelia's chastity. You remember that Ophelia describes the scene where Hamlet comes to her disheveled, half naked, mad for her out of love, right? And she tells Polonius that this happened while she was sewing in my closet. Or one of the texts says closet, the other one says sewing in my chamber. Both of those are rooms. One's a bedroom, one's a private study. They're very private rooms. And the question is, how does Hamlet get in there? Hamlet should not be allowed into either of those rooms, much less half naked. Later, when Ophelia goes mad, she sings very sexual bawdy songs. The bawdiness of those songs kind of shows the breakdown of her reason, which for women in the period was very much associated with sexual control, chastity. So a lot of people have wondered, did Hamlet and Ophelia have sex? And is this in some way connected to her madness? In Kenneth Branagh's film version, I don't know if you remember, if you've seen it, he has a sex scene between them in flashback, right? The First Quarto, there's clear evidence that the First Quarto is trying to make Ophelia more chaste. So when she tells her father about this scene, she, instead of saying, as I was sewing in my closet or as I was sewing in my chamber, she says, as I was walking here in the gallery, this very public space. She's also repeatedly called a maiden or a virgin at moments where the play, we know, does not do that. Now in Brudermord, the bodiness and her sexuality is heightened, but in a different way, I think, from the play we know. When Hamlet tells Ophelia, get thee to a nunnery, you remember this in the scene where he constantly tells her, get thee to a nunnery, a lot of critics have argued that nunnery is a pun because it could be slang for a brothel in Shakespeare's England. Well, in Brudermord, he says, it's like he makes the joke very clear, get thee to a nunnery, but not to the nunnery where two pairs of slippers stand by the bedside. So it's made explicit. And when Ophelia goes mad, she starts in a kind of love-crazed, sex-crazed way, chasing after this male character. She keeps telling him, we'll go to bed together, I'm going to wash your body, and you wash my body, these very bawdy moments. But weirdly, she also keeps saying, I'm not going to go to bed to you until we go to church. So it's like a strange, sex-crazed, but really chaste and conservative Ophelia at the same time. And that brings me to the last point I want you to keep your eye on, which is the question of religion. Because Shakespeare's Hamlet, famously, Hamlet is very unsure about what happens to us after we die. When he gives the to be or not to be speech, there's no mention of God or the afterlife. And the only reason we don't kill ourselves, he says, is that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, right, and prevents us from doing anything. He has sort of no idea what happens to us after we die. No one has come back to tell us. He's conveniently forgetting his Christianity here, right, since Jesus has come back from the undiscovered country to tell us. He dies saying the rest is silence, right, like he has nothing to say about what the rest after death might be. Again, that idea of emptiness after death. The First Quarto seems to move in a very Protestant direction. In To Be or Not to Be, in the First Quarto version, Hamlet's not worried about the dread of something after death. The reason we don't kill ourselves is the joyful hope of something after death. And that is when we're born before an everlasting judge, who never appears in To Be or Not to Be in the familiar version, at whose sight the happy smile and the accursed damned. So in the First Quarto version of To Be or Not to Be, Hamlet knows exactly what happens after death. You go, God judges you, either you go to heaven or you go to hell. And this Hamlet, instead of saying, the rest is silence, at his death he says, heaven received my soul. Confident he's going to heaven, like a good predestined Protestant. Brudermord seems to push the play in a much more Catholic direction, though it's hard to tell whether it's Catholic or kind of anti-Catholic. There's a lot of Catholicism in it that's not in there in the familiar version. There's a ton of talk about saints in this play at moments where we don't. In fact, the play loves saints so much that at one point it invents a new saint, Saint Velton. No one has any idea who this guy is. And there's a moment in the closet scene where the queen, I don't know if any of you have been watching Wolf Hall or reading it, or anyway, if you follow Henry VIII, the queen says that in order to marry Claudius, she had to get a papal dispensation to marry her husband's brother, right? So this is very Reformation-y, Henry VIII. It's very hard for me to tell reading the script. I'm sure in performance they will have had to make a choice about this, whether this is like piously Catholic or mocking, since Claudius is not a great guy, Gertrude is not great in the play, maybe mocking the Pope for having done this, right? Here again, we see these other versions of Hamlet kind of pushing a sort of ambiguous moment in the play in different directions. Okay, so these are just three themes that struck me when I read the text that we could keep your eye on and decide. You could decide for yourself whether this hypothesis seems to make sense. That's hardly all there is in the play, so I don't want to prevent you from seeing other things in the play. It's also, of course, I haven't seen it, but from everything I've heard, a wonderful piece of theater in its own right. It's not just a scholarly exercise. So I hope also we'll just sit back and enjoy the show. Thanks. We have time for a few questions. We have time for questions?
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions.
I'm going to wait like you did.
Huh?
I'm going to wait like you did until a question arises.
How did you find the guy with the Hamlet puppet in his basement?
There, he published a catalog. He has a little museum. It's like he takes some of the stuff from his basement and puts it in another building sometimes, and then you go see it, and that's the museum. But he published a very nice looking catalog. And one page is Hamlet, and he's very confident it's Hamlet, and he knows who carved it, and where and when. So Tiffany had this book, and I was in Bologna for the semester, and she noticed that the guy said Bologna, so I looked him up, and I called him, and he was super excited, and he had me out. He served me like a 10-course lunch, the way you get in Italy. We had a lot of conversation. He explained to me all about puppets. He told me how some puppets, he was a real committed socialist, and he told me how some puppets, these kind that you operate from above, that's like the capitalist puppet because it's like they're controlling you from above. And the puppets you operate from below, those are the people's puppets. Those are like the Marxist puppets because they're rising up from below. It was a fun afternoon. Yeah.
He said he has potentially
A script.
A script.
Yeah.
And are you still in contact with him? Is there any
I've
way that you
tried.
can try again?
I'm going to try again this summer. I mean, I've tried every time I've been near Bologna to get in touch with him because Tiffany and I mean, it's in Italian. We want to translate it into English and see what it is. I'm starting to worry he doesn't really have it because he told me he had it. He couldn't find it. He didn't have the key to one of the doors, and he wouldn't let me in. And every time I've gotten in touch, like I've emailed him and called him, and he never gets back to me.
Perhaps he has other Shakespeare. I mean, because with
Yeah,
the different.
he could have anything in there.
starring
I saw
Shakespeare.
4 or 5 puppets. I didn't see any other Shakespeare. I saw a bunch of puppets. He has a Charlemagne puppet from the 1500s, he says. Yeah, he has some incredible puppets. So it might be him, it might not. It is a really cool puppet, a very early puppet, and he has a lot of them.
Do you think he has a place, like a museum or somewhere they'll go when he dies?
I hope so. Yeah, he was in good health, though. He's got a while left in him, I hope. Yeah.
How would you talk to students reading a play in a humanities seminar, looking at the textbook footnotes, yada yada, Q1, F1, blah blah blah? How do you get to something interesting?
I tried to do that, Lauren.
You did not tell them how to find their own.
How to find their own. Well, this is one of the things I do teach passages from these alternate texts in my Hamlet class. One of the nice things is if you've read Hamlet, and most of us have read it at some point or seen it, you can kind of have it playing in the background, right? And as you watch this and try to pick out moments that seem to you to differ in interesting ways. So I tried to suggest a few of them. There's plenty of others. And the hypothesis here is that some of this is accounted for by the fact that it's a puppet show. So can these differences be accounted for by difference in the linguistic context, in the dramatic medium, puppet versus live action? That's Tiffany's theory, at least for some of them. You may not feel that all of it can be accounted for by that. I think there's other changes that have been made along the way. There's whole plots here that you will not remember from Hamlet. There's a weird plot about a guy who is worried because he hasn't paid his taxes in a few years, and he's worried he's going to get arrested. There's nothing in Shakespeare about this, right? This is kind of you don't expect to see it in a Shakespearean tragedy. One of my favorites, the guy who's the head of the acting troupe that arrives, right, to do the play within the play, is named Carl. You just don't see Carl pop in a Shakespeare play, right? But it's a good German name. Yeah.
I was wondering, are there other more well-known plays that have been really known and made into plays?
Yes, we have a Romeo and Juliet text. We know of a bunch of them, but we only have text for some of them.
Are these for children, or are they just for like a popular audience, or do you know who the audience was for them?
I don't think it's for children. I hope it's not for children. No, puppet shows were very popular and widespread. I mean, it was particularly in Italy, in Germany, and in England. And they were for all, it wasn't yet sort of associated particularly with children. And they perform, highly sexual and violent. The violence we still get in puppet shows, but the real body sexual stuff is not for children now.
Maybe one more question?
I was just going to say, we have to tone down the show depending on who our audience is. So if we have children, there's sexual references
You don't
that we
do.
really have to pull back on significantly in this one.
Of course, children now are different from children 300 years ago, maybe. So I'm not saying there were no children there, but it was all the records we have are really about adults going to see these.
And so when would it come in performed? Just sort of they would travel around and they show them how you do puppet show? Or?
Well, these English actors were going. This is, on the one hand, it seems like a kind of popular art form, but they were traveling to the courts of dukes and things like that. So it was also a high art form. In England, there, at a fair, there would be people selling goods, like there'd be fairs for cloth or fairs for all different produce. And there would also be puppet stands, there would be juggling, there would be dancing animals, animal tricks, all kind of like a circus environment. They would perform there.
Yeah.
Are there more puppet references thrown in, or like I'm being pulled around by strings, or oh to be puppeted, or anything?
No. In fact, puppet references are taken out because, right, in before the play, within the play, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, Hamlet talks about seeing puppets, right? But that doesn't mean anything. I mean, this play, if you buy Shakespeare's Hamlet, it's like this. This play's like 20 pages. I mean, it's short, so a lot of stuff is taken out. But no, there's not explicit puppet references. So the question is, can we infer from the dramaturgy of the show and from the content that it might relate to puppetry? And I think there's some aspects that you may, of course, this is a very good puppet performance, so it's going to persuade you. Right.
Okay, we're out of time. So you're welcome to join us in the lobby. The English department is going to have a little reception before the show starts at 7:30. If you are there are a few rows here that we need to reserve for various consented reasons. So if you are in this row or this row, if you can reshuffle to a different row, that would be helpful. And you're welcome to leave your stuff here and hold a seat if you'd like to get up and move around. The programs are out now too if you haven't grabbed a hold of it. Thank you very much, Zach.